Jestem dobrze słyszalna? O tak, teraz lepiej. Poczekamy jeszcze chwileczkę. Tutaj na logistykę, dziękujemy bardzo. Szanowni Państwo, jest mi niezmiernie miło powitać Państwa w Domu Europy. Jak również chciałam powitać wszystkich, którzy oglądają nas zdalnie. Mam nadzieję, że to grono również jest liczne. Ja się nazywam Karolina Borońska-Hryniewiecka, reprezentuję Katedrę Jeana Monneta oraz Instytut Politologii Uniwersytetu Wrocławskiego i będę moderować dzisiejszą debatę na temat przyszłości demokracji i reform Unii Europejskiej po wyborach do Parlamentu, o których mówił przed chwilą Stephen Clark w bardzo wzruszający sposób. Zanim przejdę do przedstawienia naszych szacownych gości, dyskutantów, pozwolę sobie na krótką dygresję. Patrząc na ostatnie 2 tygodnie, widzę czas Polski w Unii Europejskiej, widzę czas Polski i Europy zarazem. Zacznę może od 25 kwietnia, kiedy to prezydent Francji Emmanuel Macron wygłosił swoje przemówienie o przyszłości Europy na Uniwersytecie Sorbońskim i wspomniał o naszym kraju aż 2 razy. Pierwszy raz wspomniał o Polsce jako o jednym z najważniejszych sojuszników Francji w obecnych czasach, a także o kraju, z którym niedługo Francja podpisze nowy traktat o współpracy. Za drugim razem wspomniał o Polsce, przedstawiając ją jako przykład demokracji w działaniu, mając na myśli wyniki wyborów do naszego parlamentu w ubiegłym roku, w październiku. Kilka dni później, 1 maja, jak Państwo wszyscy wiecie, Unia Europejska świętowała swoje największe rozszerzenie, a Polska świętowała 20-lecie swojego członkostwa. 2 dni temu, 6 maja, Komisja Europejska zdecydowała, że nadszedł czas po 6 latach, aby zdjąć z Polski procedurę naruszenia rządów prawa, co niebawem nastąpi. No i wreszcie wczoraj w Katowicach nasz premier Donald Tusk wraz z kandydatką na przewodniczącą Komisji Europejskiej i obecną przewodniczącą Komisji Ursulą von der Leyen przedstawili swój plan dla Europy. No i teraz czas na Wrocław. Dlatego jestem niezmiernie zaszczycona, że zaproszenie nasze przyjęli tutaj tak znamienici goście. Jest mi ogromnie miło powitać pana ministra Marka Prawdę, podsekretarza stanu w Ministerstwie Spraw Zagranicznych, odpowiedzialnego za politykę europejską i wschodnią. Pan minister Prawda między 2016 a 2021 rokiem był dyrektorem przedstawicielstwa Komisji Europejskiej w Polsce. Wcześniej pełnił funkcję stałego przedstawiciela Polski przy Unii Europejskiej, a jeszcze wcześniej był ambasadorem w Niemczech i w Szwecji. Witamy. Dzień dobry. Zdalnie łączy się z nami, mam nadzieję, Kalypso Nicolaidis. Nie wiem, czy już mamy ją na wizji. Jeśli nie, to za chwilkę wrócę do naszej gościni. Natomiast przejdę zatem do Jarosława Pietrasa, starszego analityka z Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies w Brukseli, który jest jednocześnie profesorem wizytującym w College of Europe w Bruggi. Wcześniej, co bardzo ważne, był wieloletnim dyrektorem generalnym w Radzie Unii Europejskiej, także zna Unię Europejską od podszewki, a jeszcze wcześniej był szefem Urzędu Komitetu Integracji Europejskiej w Polsce. Są również z nami członkowie bardzo ważnej grupy 12. Jest to Nguyen, wicedyrektorka Jacques Delors Center z Berlina oraz Nicolai von Ondarza z Niemieckiego Instytutu Spraw Międzynarodowych i Bezpieczeństwa w Berlinie. Oboje są członkami znanej Group of 12, czyli francusko-niemieckiej grupy ekspertów powołanej przez 2 rządy, Francję i Niemcy, którzy opracowali bardzo obszerny projekt reform Unii Europejskiej. i nad którym to projektem rozmawiają grona w wielu krajach, a dzisiaj również i my. No i wreszcie widzę online Kalypso Nicolaidis. Bardzo mi miło, Kalypso, że jesteś z nami. Jest to profesor ze School of Transnational Governance w Europejskim Instytucie Uniwersyteckim we Florencji, gdzie między innymi Kalypso przewodniczy projektowi Democratic Odyssey, czyli Demokratycznej Odysei. Jest to projekt bardzo nowatorski, który ma na celu stworzenie stałego zgromadzenia obywatelskiego, tak zwanego Citizens Assembly, które będzie współdecydować o sprawach europejskich. I taki pilotażowy projekt zostanie zrealizowany już niebawem w Atenach na jesieni 2024 roku. Witaj, Kalypso. Proszę Państwa, jako że nasza dyskusja ma wymiar międzynarodowy i również słyszy nas pewnie wiele osób z zagranicy, pozwolę sobie teraz przejść na język angielski i poproszę również osoby, które tego potrzebują, na włączenie swoich tłumaczeń symultanicznych. So let me start by again recalling Macron. There's something about France here. In his speech at the Sorbonne, Macron several times have underlined that we are living in a world where rules of the games have changed. He underlined that on many levels: economic, political, geopolitical, and cultural. Yesterday, Donald Tusk has said something like that. Only a blind man could pretend that nothing has changed. So basically, he repeated the sense of Macron. In this context, in view of all the current political, geopolitical challenges, like war in Ukraine, behind our border, the prospect of EU enlargement, which is probably now our geopolitical must, the specter of Trump in the United States, growing strength of right-wing parties, and also obviously unfair competition, economic competition, and global trade policy from China and others. In this context, what do you think are the most important reforms that the EU should undertake, regardless of whether they require or not treaty changes? And I would like to refer first to the representative of the Polish government, Minister Prawda. Poland is the new leader of Europe, therefore we are very curious about the point of view that you're going to present. Marek.
Europa znajduje się w tej chwili w momencie przełomu, to znaczy od fabryki reguł przechodzi do takiego stadium właściwie wspólnoty losu. Od współzależności do nieuchronnej konfrontacji. To znaczy nam się wydawało, że jak będziemy z kimś handlować, to on będzie wcześniej czy później tacy jak my, że poprzez stosunki gospodarcze będziemy eksportowali wartości. Nam się wydawało, że eksportujemy wartości, a importowaliśmy chaos. I ta współzależność stawała się także narzędziem psucia, czyli właściwie narzędziem szantażu, dawała taką możliwość. To jest jeden proces, jeden taki wymuszony proces, który wpływa na znaczenie Polski, zaraz o tym powiem. Druga rzecz to jest to, o czym mówił przed chwilą Steven, co ja bym nazwał uwschodnieniem Unii Europejskiej. Na tym polega właśnie to przejście do innej wrażliwości, do definicji tego, czym jest Europa. To znaczy element wschodni stał się nieuchronnym uzupełnieniem tożsamości europejskiej w ogóle. I to ma poważne konsekwencje, ponieważ zrozumiano, że aby sprostać zagrożeniu putinowskiej Rosji, trzeba wykorzystać ekspertyzę Wschodu. To są dwa procesy, które można najkrócej określić jako zwrot geopolityczny. I teraz Polska w tej sprawie może być potrzebna. Polska definiowała do tej pory w Unii swoją niezbędność, tak to nazwę, czyli swoją przydatność, w taki sposób, że była łącznikiem między tymi, którzy mają mniej i tymi, którzy mają więcej, ci, którzy są w grupie euro i ci, którzy są poza grupą euro. Polska była dostarczycielem pewnego towaru, takiej tkanki łącznej między tymi grupami i otrzymywała premię za to, że ten towar miał wzięcie. To znaczy każdy miał interes w tym, żeby Unia była połączona i każdy wobec tego miał interes, żeby dobrze się wiodło temu, który ten towar dowozi. Ale to się zmienia i dzisiaj Polska znajduje się też w takim momencie nowego definiowania swojej niezbędności. Bo dzisiaj ta jedność jest ważna, ale bardzo ważne są również takie rzeczy, o których tutaj dzisiaj mówiliśmy, mianowicie zmiany, wymuszone, konieczne zmiany i Polska swoją niezbędność musi dzisiaj zdefiniować w taki sposób, do jakiego stopnia jest w stanie się do tego przyczynić do skutecznego wzięcia tego zakrętu. I tutaj Trójkąt Weimarski pojawia się po raz pierwszy nie jako podgrupa tandemu niemiecko-rosyjskiego, niemiecko-francuskiego, ale jako samodzielny byt, który ma do zaproponowania Europie parę rozwiązań. I właśnie jesteśmy na takim etapie, kiedy te rozwiązania powinny wyjść właśnie z tej konstelacji, ponieważ, jak mówiłem, Europa jest uwschodniona, w związku z tym Polska może troszkę skompensować swoją względną różnicę potencjału wobec tych dwóch krajów. I tutaj oczywiste są trzy takie zadania. Po pierwsze, oczywiście ustanowienie Unii Obronnej, umocnienie efektywnej wspólnej polityki bezpieczeństwa zagranicznej i bezpieczeństwa. Europa przestaje być zajęta tylko zarządzaniem zbiorowym szczęściem, tylko musi po prostu działać w sytuacji zagrożeń, musi działać w sytuacji niepogody politycznej. Po drugie, mamy rozszerzenie, które jest wyzwaniem i które zawiera nie tylko zagrożenia, ale przede wszystkim, i taki jest dziś język w Unii Europejskiej, szansę na to, aby nie było szarych stref, aby poprzez nowatorskie podejście do procesu rozszerzenia podnosić status bezpieczeństwa naszych partnerów, a tym samym całej Unii. I może, jeżeli miałbym zakończyć właśnie tymi trzema zadaniami, to jako trzecie zadanie określiłbym tutaj zwiększenie skuteczności mechanizmu unijnego reagowania na łamanie praworządności. Zyskaliśmy rzadkie doświadczenia w tej dziedzinie i Unia dzisiejsza przestaje być tylko Unią Solidarności, a staje się Unią Solidarności warunkowej. Unia jest wspólnotą normatywną. Jeżeli chce się odzywać w sprawach ważnych na całym świecie, to musi posprzątać w domu, czyli musi mieć porządek, jeśli chodzi o przestrzeganie praworządności, wtedy będzie silna. Także ja bym w tych trzech obszarach widział zadania i jeszcze raz tylko wspomnę, ponieważ o tym mówiłaś, o tym elemencie współpracy polsko-francuskiej, polsko-niemieckiej, to tutaj trójkąt weimarski ma swoje momentum i swoją konieczność zaproponowania całej Europie kilku rozwiązań. I to jest też taki kontekst, właśnie o czym już mówiłem, wytłumaczenia takiej nowej polskiej niezbędności w Unii.
Bardzo mi się podoba ta koncepcja nowej polskiej niezbędności. Zanim oddam głos, excuse me, I actually should be speaking English, I promise that. So before I pass on the floor to the other people present here, I would like to call on Kalypso and also refer the same question to Florence now. What, in your opinion, Kalypso, are the most important, urgent reforms that the EU should undertake, regardless of whether they require or not treaty changes?
Thank you, Carolina. And let me first say that I wish I was there with you in Wrocław.
Me too.
Because as you know, to me, speaking about our countries, our place where we live, and Europe has to be intertwined. And this is how we should enter these European elections, connecting to people's everyday life. And I think what has already been said by Stephen Clark and Minister Pravda speaks to this. But let me just, because for the sake of time, argue that yes, as you imply, Carolina, we are, and has been said many, many times, we are entering the era of a geostrategic Europe. But these are big words. These are big words. What do they mean? Many things. But I would like to argue, and I argue on the doorsteps or on the Zoom steps. I'm not quite sure how we talk about that when we are in campaign mode. I'd like to argue that this is also, this geopolitical Europe should be about what I call citizen power Europe, that Europe's power in the world is grounded on the power that it gives to the collective intelligence, passions, expertise of its citizens, including politicians who are, after all, citizens too. And let me put this in 3 points. First, the story we tell is so important. And this extremely moving film that Stephen Clark showed us, I hadn't seen it, Stephen, but really speaks to the fact, and I apologize because my mascara is a bit dropped here. I'm the last generation who's heard these stories live from their parents. So to retell them is so important, and we know it matters that we are still a project of peaceful coexistence. It matters, and it matters especially to the young, as we see now in the Middle East. We need to speak about this, and we need to speak about this let me just pick 2 ways. One is Minister Pravda talked about Poland, beautifully about Poland as translator and mediator. These 20 years that we're celebrating, we need to remind ourselves this is what's going on with this election. These are the enlargement elections, actually. The next 5 years, I don't need to tell this to people in the room. But this means that we are in a moment of like a relay marathon of democracy. So the famous or infamous 10 ought to be the biggest champion of democracy in a kind of process of mutual learning. And of course, there is the issue of Poland, of Ukraine, but Southeastern Europe and the Balkans, and how you do democracy in countries that are still in some various ways in deep transition. That is a very important story of peace, because of course, that part of Europe is so unstable. But the second, actors I would like to put in the middle of our conversation is, of course, the next generation, because that film was a beautiful demonstration that never before in the world has there been so many generations alive and well to talk to one another, 5 or 6 generations. And so the young, how do we motivate them? How do we speak? Minister Pravda of Europe of Security, and of course in Poland, it is so important these days. But let's face it, young people across Europe, are most swayed by the local and the global, much more than any version of any kind of Euro-nationalist. So how do we understand Europe becoming a place that organizes some version of an interconnected armies, etc.? It's not true that the young had forgotten Europe was a peace project before Ukraine, and certainly not now. But they ask questions about our strange double standards. They ask questions about, will Europe have enough safeguards to protect our world against AI-enabled weapons? How do we deal? Why do we subcontract the management of our borders? These are part of the European policy, constellation that we need to have responses. We cannot borrow peace from the instability of the rest of the world. And that moves me to my second question, which is, or second set of concerns, which is that Europe is not just about, coexistence, but it's about mutual recognition, recognizing our diversity, about as Stephen Clark spoke about, not taking back control, but keeping control. And I mean, I want to mention here that when we say that to people about Europe, yeah, they can think about Europe versus their state, but also the internal fabrics of their own state. And there is no better place to say that than Poland, which is renegotiating its social contract, obviously, as we speak, and as illustrated in a beautiful book, Let's Agree on Poland, that was edited by Maciej Kilikowski and Anna Wojciuk, which I hope everybody in the room has. But in that book, of course, what is raised is the issue of how we think about mutual recognition between our different ways in Poland across regions, Voivoda, but also different ways of doing politics, different ideologies, cultures, etc. How do they both coexist, but also mingle with each other? Well, that's the same story in Europe. And we need to be able to tell that story of diversity and mutual recognition. And are we always good at this? For instance, how do you, my friends in Poland, manage on the doorstep for European election, the whole question of, rule of law? And finally, Europe a few days ago gave the, Poland, you're kosher now on rule of law. But isn't it much deeper than that? This is about renegotiating the whole ideological bargain in Poland, social, economic, regions that agree, don't agree. How do we speak about how Europe does interference in national politics? Or empowerment? You can use bad terms, good terms, but in the name of what is Warsaw affected by what Europe decides? Well, that's because, in a way, this is about what some actors in Poland argue, a huge majority, yes, but others not. So how do you tread that line? For me, is a fascinating question. And of course, Caroline, you have beautiful work on the interaction between national parliaments, national court, how all of these interactions horizontally affect European voters, including in Poland. And this leads me to, my last point. And of course, let me just say that this relates, I think young people, I said before, I think, relate much more to the local and the global than to Europe. So they will ask on the doorstep, well, okay, this whole geopolitical Europe, what does it mean about all our friends with our networks in the global South, young people in the global South, so-called geoeconomics? So how do we think about geoeconomics in a way that's consistent with the way we act in Europe, including how we manage our borders, and of course, big agenda of Poland. So how do we not create instability in other countries by externalizing the way we manage our borders? How do we recognize the kind, it's all very nice to have CBAM. That's part of the big reforms to climate change, Green Deal, and how to create a level playing field with the world. But as we are doing this, we are destabilizing countries in the South, even if we help them in other ways, supposedly help. We can't help them as a charity. You know, we're in a post-colonial world, and the young people are very, very often very cognizant of that. So how do we do green without being self-righteous or even possibly destructive and sometimes extractive in their countries? If we don't have a response to this, we don't speak to the young. And Caroline, that leads me to my very last point, because you very kindly referred to the democratic odyssey. So I spoke about peaceful coexistence. I spoke about mutual recognition of our diversity inside Europe and with the global South. But thirdly, I would like to raise my biggest, agenda for Europe, which is democratic transformation. And everybody's saying this, yes. But what does it mean? And I think it's important to say, and Caroline, we said that in our report that we wrote together, and I hope everybody clicks on the web to find the radicality of sunlight, because a report at CEPS, because what does it mean is above all to shed huge transparency and empowerment throughout Europe by the EU. And so when we have a whole big, very sophisticated conversation about saying democracy is about switching from unanimity to qualified majority voting, in my experience, the average citizen doesn't care that much about this. And in fact, they might understand we can't leave Europe hostage to the Orbans of this world. But on the other hand, they're like, well, yeah, but Brussels, how do I control it? How does my prime minister control it? It's not that straightforward. And we need to all take in, of course, that there is an underlying condition of possibility, a Hegelian condition of possibility for QMV on foreign policy, which is existential, and that is trust. We're not going to get people understanding that this can happen without radical trust in what Europe can do if it puts you in a minority. And that leads me to the fact that the biggest condition of possibility for that, which is what happens at the top and will require treaty change and all of that, is to spread and for Europe to empower what I call the third democratic transformation with Dal. We had the ancient Greeks, we had the parliament, and now we have a radically new entrance in a democratic age that is threatened by backsliding all over the world, by democratic malaise, by autocrats. But on the other side, we have the good guys. And this third democratic transformation is about how we create a system, a legal political system where citizens can have citizens' initiative, referenda, but also citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, where they own their own institutions, their own EU institutions to a great extent. And that's what we're doing with the Democratic Odyssey project, which you can find also on the web.
Thank you very much, Kalypso. Well, that made us thinking, because we started from a hardcore issues like security, like common defense policy. We moved through rule of law to the very communicative instruments that Kalypso has mentioned and how important they are for reconnecting with citizens. So now I would turn from Florence to Brussels, and I would like to pose the same question to Jarosław. So, in your opinion, the most important urgent EU reforms to undertake?
I hope it works. First of all, when we speak about reforms, very often we start about things, what should be changed? Whereas I think we should start from saying, from trying to understand what is a problem that you would like to address. So are we seeing problems of Europe that we would like to address? For example, one of such a problem, which is very often not fully seen, is the issue of belonging to Europe, the feeling of belonging, where the societies have got understanding and association with Europe. If they are kind of neutral to Europe, without emotional approach, then suddenly many things that happened, they simply ignored. So we should address the way how we can engage European citizens to make them feeling of belonging. Mm-hmm. So it means the reforms should relate to that. Very often, obviously, these reforms can be related to the way how we democratically govern. But I think as Kalypso has rightly said, we are very often concentrating too much on qualified majority voting, which is just one small element of the whole puzzle. And it doesn't make people feeling that we are belonging if they see that something is being decided that way or another way. So we have to address underlying root of making people engaged with this, feeling that Europe is their place, and the Europe gives them additional powers, additional understanding, and they are associated with that. So here, maybe the recent times, the poly-crisis that we had makes a huge contribution, because suddenly people see that Europe can better solve the problems than individually member states. For example, we have a question of defense. So, for example, for me, one of the purposes of the reforms should be to put a question how we could strengthen, not maybe defense in this sense, but how we could strengthen security of Europe, including resilience to what comes from outside as a threat. For example, I see these posters here on fake news. I mean, are we resilient to this type of measures? Are we not only military thing? No, it's a much wider thing. Mm-hmm. And if people feel that Europe is doing things that protects, then it's obviously much better. But resilience is not only that, it's also about, for example, economic resilience, when you've got issue of strategic open autonomy, that you've got your economy that is able to survive even if chains of supply would be broken. So you have to think in terms how to deal with that. And here, for example, what we should have is to have a discussion about resources that Europe has in its disposal. So we should have a reform looking at what kind of, we cannot continue to give more competences to Europe, decided in a qualified majority, and have no resources for that. You cannot increase competences with those, it has to go together. So you have to find the ways how to enlarge competences of Europe together with the ability to deliver. So this is, and finally, one small thing, which is the biggest one, which is a question that I have, it's a bit of philosophical. Can we have better Europe and reform of Europe with components which are not very good? Can you have a democracy on European level if you've got inside the countries parties which have got increasing importance in undermining democracy? Mm-hmm. So can we have Europe which is composed of countries which openly, intentionally are trying to say, we don't want to follow European rules? And we have seen such countries, and you even have seen the constitutional courts saying European Court of Justice should not have a predominance on some issues. So it's intentionally said. I have noted in one very important politician saying Europe will not dictate to us in a country which is very old part of Europe. So then there's a question. How do we address this issue of position towards Europe if the components of this are not very, very good? Let me finish.
Yes, thank you very much, Jarosław, for adding new elements to this urgency of reforming Europe. Now I will turn to Tu and ask about your take on all of that, the urgency of reforms.
Thank you very much, Karolina, and let me thank you also first for the invitation. I'm very, very happy to be here.
Our pleasure.
And to discuss this very important topic. And after these very emotional interventions also, and pleas for more democratic transformation from the previous speakers, I almost feel bad to go back to a bit more dry questions of institutional reforms and institutions, but that is sort of where I come from. And looking ahead to the future and the challenges that we are facing and where Europe is headed, I would say these three things where I would see the biggest need for reform. And one is really the rule of law and strengthening the instruments to protect the rule of law in the member states. And we have heard this from previous speakers. And this is because, of course, rule of law is a fundamental value of the EU, but it also very practically underlies the way the European Union works. So if we look at the internal market, the single market, a lot of EU policies, they do not work if there are no independent courts in the member states. And it is also a question of credibility. How credible are we on the world stage in the changing world if we cannot protect our own values at home? And also, how credible are we towards our citizens? Can we justify that EU money, European funding, goes to member state where the standards are not the ones that we have actually subscribed to in the beginning when we founded the European Union, right? So I think that is actually probably the most important reform. The second two reforms that sort of both relate to the same question of capacity to act. And one is, of course, the question of unanimity. And I actually think it is important to talk about it. And it's not so much about introducing QMV, but I think it's really about the question how to avoid abuse of the veto power. And Viktor Orban has been mentioned. And I think this also relates back to the rule of law. And it is the question of, is the European Union being held hostage by one leader that no longer adheres to our values? Does that have an effect on the rule of law? Do we have the feeling or does the impression arise that European funding can be blackmailed against the giving up of a veto? And I think these are actually fundamental questions, both for the question, can the EU act, but also how it is perceived both externally and internally to the citizens. And then the last question, or the last part that I think is also very important, is the question of funding and the EU budget. So negotiations will come up for the next long cycle of the EU budget next year. And enlargement will, of course, be one factor that plays into the question of the budget. But we have actually done a study at the Jacques Delors Center, and our findings were, yes, it will cost, but not as much as it is perhaps sometimes reported in the media. But enlargement is not the only thing that will come in or that will put pressure on the budget. We have the question of defense, of security, we have climate change that is still there, even though perhaps not quite as present as during the last elections, digitalization. So there's a lot of challenges. And at the same time, we have a fiscal cliff that is coming up because Next Generation EU, so this big recovery fund that was set up in 2020, will run out in 2026. So in 2.5 years. So in 2.5 years, we will actually have a situation where member states no longer have this money that is now being invested in reforms, in investments, in the green transition, in digital transition. So the question of how do we finance all of these future tasks, all of these challenges, and all of things that we also want the European Union to do, I think will be a very, very big one, and actually also a very challenging question. So I think the question of do we get a bigger budget and also more flexible budget will be one of the key questions and also key reforms that we will need to be dealt with.
Thank you very much, too. Yeah, it resonates very much with what Jarosław said about, the need to have resources to implement ambitious reforms. And last but not least, Nicolai, what is your take? Has everything been said already, or do you have something to add there from?
That's always a question when you're the last one on such a splendid panel where so many interesting things have been said. First, thank you for the invitation. And maybe I'm going to take the approach of contradicting myself by saying two different things that are maybe a little bit in tension with each other. And the first I would say is that for the major policy questions of today, the EU doesn't need institutional reforms. I think it's quite interesting that if you listen to Macron's speech, he delivered this sense of urgency of an EU under threat. This Europe can die was one of his main messages. And his answers were mostly on the policy level. So saying this Europe is under threat because we're in a geostrategic situation where war has returned on a large scale to Europe. We're under threat of becoming from a player to a play ball between the US and China and Russia. Europe is under threat economically because if you look at the major companies in artificial intelligence and tech and so on, they all come either from the US or China, with very little in Europe. And so the main task in terms of strengthening our competitiveness, our security, trying to find investments for defense, that was already mentioned. I think these are tasks that are very, very urgent, and they don't need institutional reform, they need political will. And therefore, I think the main message for the European leaders after these elections is to take the results of the elections and then together decide on a program that comes together with a sense of urgency, of implementing the policies, finding the financing, and finding the common ground. And I think if we look back at the last 10 to 15 years, the EU has always only been able, if it was close enough to the cliff. Sometimes in political science we speak about failing forward, of the EU only being able to agree on grand programs like Next Generation EU or the joint buying of vaccines if the cliff is close enough. I don't know myself whether Macron's Europe can die impression is strong enough, but I hope that political leaders do not need this absolute sense of mortality of Europe, but rather the sense of trying to address these grand challenges in the next 5 years to come to urgent policy decisions. And then where I contradict myself, and this is my second point, is what brings the institutional questions on the horizon is enlargement. And sometimes when I talk with colleagues from Central and Eastern Europe, there is maybe the slight accusation or maybe the suspicion that countries like Germany and also France are not really serious about enlargement and bring up institutional reforms because they somehow want to hinder enlargement. They don't really want Ukraine as a member of the European Union. And I would maybe argue the other way around, at least speaking from Berlin, precisely because there is now this clear analysis that in order to get rid of these gray zones, Ukraine has to become a member of the EU, and it's in our very, very own geostrategic interest to bring Ukraine into the EU. This has become a realistic, not only vision, but a clear goal. But that the prospect of Ukraine and the Western Balkan countries and Moldova joining the EU will change the Union so fundamentally, this has to come with institutional reform. And the easiest image I sometimes like to use that by sheer coincidence, if you add the population size of the 6 Western Balkan countries, Moldova, Georgia and Ukraine together, you get about the size of the United Kingdom, which has just left us. But you would get 9 times the vetoes, 9 times the commissioners, about twice the numbers of members of the European Parliament, and around 10% of UK GDP. And if you add that together, you know that basically in every institution you will have to have adaptations, but you will also have to talk about, if you look at Polish farmers, about agriculture policy, about the budget, about cohesion fund. And therefore I would turn sort of the phrasing a little bit around and say, if you want to be serious about enlargement, you have to be serious about reform. And this is why I hope, and this is maybe the sort of connection to the very first speakers, that with the revitalized Weimar Triangle, we can have this conversation about reform between Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw on an equal level, not to say this is a blockade to enlargement, but because we have to address these questions in the next 5 years, and really alongside the questions on defense, security, competitiveness, climate, also work in parallel on the institutional strand to get the EU ready.
Thank you so much, Nicolai. And I have to say that you have stolen one of my points and questions, so I need to reshift now the way I will frame it. But this is great because I'm exactly going to talk now about the treaty reforms, so the elephant in the room. In 2023, we know that the European Parliament and also the Franco-German group of 12, they proposed 2 different separate comprehensive packages on EU reforms, including treaty changes. But there is no political will in the Council, in the European Council, to even substantially discuss these reforms. We know that the file is hanging there. We know that more or less there is half-half division between those willing to undertake the discussion and start the convention and those who definitely say no. Poland is in the camp of no. And when we ask, when member states leaders from skeptical countries are asked why, they are rarely asked why, but when they are asked why they are against, they say simply, citizens don't want treaty reforms. We are not prepared for them. They are not ready for them. We're going to have another no in the referenda. However, when we look at European opinion surveys from Eurobarometer or other sources, we actually see that citizens want more Europe in various areas. They want more common defense. They want faster and more effective decisions in foreign policy. They want more health policy being coordinated at the EU level. And if you ask them about the nitty-gritty, for example, the idea of strengthening national parliaments through the green card, which is in the European Parliament's proposal, they say, yes, great idea. This is actually increasing national sovereignty as well. So how should we understand this peculiar paradox between citizens on the one hand, and I'm not saying that everybody is for EU reforms, of course, but generally, and then the leaders saying citizens don't want these reforms. And I was supposed to ask two first about that. Then I will quickly, after you, I will turn to Marek, Pravda as well and ask from the perspective of this reluctant country, because Germany and France are open to reforms. Has anything changed? I think your coalition put the Conference on the Future of Europe in its coalition agreement, and this was the excuse to reform the EU with treaty changes. So what are we actually talking about? No, first two, and then Marek. Yes. First the progressive treaty reforms, and then reluctant states.
Yes, indeed. I think the coalition agreement is quite open on this. Maybe a word on the Conference on the Future of Europe. You said it. There were many ideas put out there by the citizens, and I think it was a great democratic experiment. But what we also saw is that the conference did not really manage to get the reform debate off the ground, if we are being honest. It wasn't really debated the way that it might possibly have been imagined by the designers of it. And what really got the reform debate going was the question of enlargement. So if we enlarge, if we become bigger, how do we manage to sort of stay or retain the capacity to act and protect our values and still be able to function. So I think that in that way the citizens' proposals did not quite have the effect on the debate on treaty reforms as really the bigger questions of where is the EU headed in the future and how will the EU look like in the next decades. That being said, I am not sure it's entirely a paradox between citizens wanting an effective EU and more European integration and the reluctance of many member states to go into the treaty reforms, because many of the arguments that we hear is also where the treaties are adapted. And I'm not saying I'm agreeing, but that is the argument, are ready to enable the EU to move faster, to do the things that we want to do. And Nicolai said it, maybe for the policy part, we do not need institutional reforms or do not need treaty changes, because if there would be political will, if there was political will, we could do it. If we talk about the introduction of QMV, for example, it could be done via bridge clauses, passerelle clauses, right? So you would not necessarily need treaty change for everything that 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 the EU wants to do. I think in some areas it would be necessary. So the rule of law is actually one of those. So if we want to strengthen the rule of law instruments really in a more deep way, then I think treaty reforms are probably unlikely to avoid. But I think it is more a question of really degrees, how much more integration and what is it that we want to do, and can we do it within the framework of the treaties? And I think there a lot of arguments is, yes, we can do it in the treaties, and it's also a box of Pandora to open the treaties. So we don't know what will happen if we open it. Maybe we will have a more deeply integrated European Union, but what if we do not? What if it goes backwards? Right? So I think there's also a bit of a fear what would happen if we do it, and I think in that way it's not so much a paradox but more different levels of the discussion.
Actually, Donald Tusk mentioned in Katowice yesterday that Poland is a leader in common sense approach to what EU institutions should be like. Marek, could you develop on that a little bit more? What is this common sense about?
I stick to Polish, so I try to be consistent.
Of course, thank you.
Znaczy, obywatele chcą Unii, która funkcjonuje, która jest skuteczna. I jest ważne, żeby dostrzegali związek między strategią polityczną a lokalnymi konsekwencjami tej strategii. Żeby widzieli związek z osobistymi korzyściami. I to, co premier Polski pewnie miał na myśli, to jest ryzyko właśnie rozejścia się tych dwóch światów, co może dawać pole do takich przypuszczeń, że chodzi o pewne radykalne reformy, które mają jakieś inne cele, to znaczy, że instytucje europejskie konkurują między sobą. Więc ja zgadzam się oczywiście z tym stanowiskiem, że jeżeli chcemy być poważnie zajęci rozszerzeniem, to musimy poważnie traktować reformy. To jest jasne. Natomiast ważne jest, żeby zacząć od dyskusji o tym, co mamy zmienić, żeby to rozszerzenie na przykład było możliwe, zmienić polityki unijne, zmienić budżet, o czym mówiła tu. I to jest pierwsza długa dyskusja, której wynikiem powinno być rozważanie, gdzie potrzebne są reformy. Także najważniejsze jest dzisiaj pewnie maksymalne wykorzystanie narzędzi, które mamy w traktacie lizbońskim, gotowość i plan reformowania polityk. Mamy też rewizyjny traktat punktowy, takie narzędzie, które pozwoli reformować wąski obszar, co do którego możemy się umówić, że jest to potrzebne. Także po pierwsze definiowanie potrzeb, obszarów, po drugie maksymalne wykorzystanie tego, co mamy, a jeżeli się nie da, no to będziemy rozmawiać o reformach. I tutaj chciałbym wygłosić taką opinię, że kraje małe i nieważne są szczęśliwe, jak mogą coś zablokować. Kraje średnie, które mają ambicje wpływania na rzeczywistość, powinny starać się na tę rzeczywistość skutecznie wpływać, tak aby Unia Europejska była efektywna, a jednocześnie żeby spełniała, żeby była zgodna z interesami tego kraju. Myślę, że Polsce do twarzy z takim drugim podejściem. Nie jest powołaniem Polski siedzieć w kącie i umierać ze strachu, że ktoś nam zrobi Unię nie po naszej myśli. Powołaniem Polski jest uczestniczyć w tej zmianie. I teraz może jeszcze na koniec taka uwaga ogólniejsza, więc no, obywatele oczywiście, jak już od czego zacząłem, no, chcą, żeby to działało. 2 przykłady. W czasie pandemii pojawiła się nowa sytuacja, kiedy wołanie o pomoc, żeby coś zrobić, ważyło więcej niż tradycyjne narzekania, że Unia się miesza. No Unia nie miała żadnych narzędzi, żeby się mieszać do spraw zdrowotności. Więc ludzie zobaczyli, że konieczne jest, aby Unia nabyła wspólnotowych narzędzi, kompetencji, żeby rozwiązać realny problem. I to bym traktował jako przełomowe doświadczenie społeczeństwa europejskiego, które zrozumiało, po co jest Unia, do czego jest potrzebne działanie wspólnotowe i tylko takie, bo inaczej ta cała zabawa nie ma sensu. Druga rzecz, emitowanie wieloletnich obligacji. To, że mamy teraz 2 budżety i jakby realizujemy 2 logiki. Logikę wspólnotową i logikę jednak państw narodowych, które ostatecznie decydują o tym pierwszym tradycyjnym budżecie. Ale ten pomysł, żeby emitować wieloletnie obligacje pod zastaw budżetu unijnego, to nie jest wymysł brukselskich biurokratów, tylko to jest wypadkowa rozważań, debat w stolicach europejskich. Bo stolice europejskie, bo Unia Europejska składa się z rządów i instytucji. To jest ten błąd, który popełniamy. Więc instytucje w imieniu Unii Europejskiej i stolice w imieniu Unii Europejskiej uznały, że lepiej jest przeżyć niż nie przeżyć. A żeby przeżyć, trzeba mieć 2 budżety. Trzeba wymyślić coś, co nam pozwoli pokonać te kłopoty wynikające właśnie z tych dramatów, które przeżywaliśmy pandemii. Czyli to jest drugi dowód na to, kiedy wspólnotowe działanie wynikające z potrzeby, a nie z tego, że Unię ktoś na desce kreślarskiej narysował w Brukseli i zmusza innych, żeby właśnie to zaakceptowali. To jest argument notorycznych psujów, którzy zawsze będą Unię w ten sposób próbować krytykować i odrzucać. Tymczasem mamy 2 fundamentalne przykłady stopniowego zrozumienia, że działanie wspólnotowe jest niezbędne, jeżeli chcemy sobie radzić z tym, co się dzieje, a mamy coraz więcej zagrożeń, które nie sposób przewidzieć.
Dziękuję bardzo, Marku, za te słowa. Ja nie wiem, czy nie jesteśmy tutaj zbyt optymistyczni, mówiąc, że doszło do jakiejś internalizacji świadomości na temat potrzeby działania wspólnotowego. Nie jestem pewna, czy do dyskursu publicznego nie przebiły się bardziej narracje eurosceptyczne dotyczące na przykład tego, że umowa o zakup szczepionek między Komisją a wielkimi koncernami farmaceutycznymi była niedostatecznie transparentna. I to jest bardzo przykre, dlatego że ja nie słyszałam osobiście, aby wielu polityków narodowych tak właśnie przedstawiało zakup wspólnych szczepionek jako dobrodziejstwo dla tych krajów, które nie mogłyby sobie pozwolić na taki szybki ich zakup, tylko raczej przebijali się znowu ci z tej drugiej, ciemnej strony planety, mówiąc o tym, ile błędów zostało popełnionych. I to jest jakaś tam lekcja dla nas i dla polityków, aby mówić o tym, co dobre. I tutaj chciałam oddać głos Nicolaiowi i zapytać, jak to jest w Niemczech, jeśli chodzi o tą gotowość do podjęcia reform, bo o ile wiemy, że rząd niemiecki jest do tego bardzo otwarty, o tyle jak to wygląda na poziomie obywateli? Czy w ogóle dyskurs o reformach się toczy? Czy obywatele, gdyby poszli teraz do referendum, prawda, byłaby zmiana traktatów zaproponowana, myślisz, że Niemcy przyjęliby tę nową wizję, którą proponuje na przykład Franco-German Report?
So, first of all, in Germany, we've never had a referendum on EU affairs. So the German constitution, after the experience of the Weimar times, doesn't foresee referendums in Germany.
That's safe, safe option.
That is, I think, I mean, we can discuss long about the wisdom of referendums, whether they really get the answers of the questions you pose, but that is certainly the choice of the German constitution not to have referendums on these kinds of questions. And so any kind of treaty reforms, but also bridge clauses and so on, would need to go through both chambers of the German parliament. And there, I think, on a sort of very meta level, you still have clear majorities for deeper European integration. And you still have the case that the main opposition parties, the conservative CDU, CSU, also defines itself as a pro-European party. So I think on this level, the consensus is still there. If you talk about citizens, it's certainly clear that we have a growing willingness to vote for parties who are critical towards European integration. And we have, for the first time in these European elections, probably around 15 to 20% which could vote either for the right-wing populist AfD or the new left-wing populist Sarah Wagenknecht party, which are also more Eurosceptic than the far left used to be in Germany. I think what is specifically interesting for the German case is that the Alternative für Deutschland has become much more radical than a lot of other far-right European parties. So if you look, for instance, the comparison to Le Pen, she's trying to moderate herself all the time. She has moved away from ideas of taking France out of the Eurozone and the Euro and try to build this sort of more moderate image, whereas the AfD, with every election, has become more radical, and now at least has this idea of a German exit from the EU in their party program. And we will see right now, if you look at polling for European election, the AfD actually scores a little bit worse on polls that are specific for the EU elections comparison to German general elections. Last year, they polled around 22% sometimes. Now for European elections, they are down to 15, but 15 is still a lot. Yeah. A lot for Germany, especially for their very radical program. And so I don't think that the AfD are anywhere near power in Germany. Mm-hmm. But certainly we now have this sentiment of Euroscepticism also present in the German political scene. I also want to say a final word about this relationship between citizens and reforms. And I feel there is kind of a common trauma since the Lisbon Treaty and the Constitutional Treaty of political leaders afraid of facing citizens. And we can see that in the reform enlargement debate. In October, December last year, there was a real dynamic in Brussels. We had the Granada summit, we had the European Council in October, which said in December, we're opening up accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, and we'll have a conversation about reform. And that conversation has completely died down. And I think a real big part of that is because no government wants to talk about reform before the European elections. That's just the way it is. I think we have to be open about that. And this is this fear of governments of trying to engage the citizens on these reform questions. And as Kalypso said, rather than being afraid of the citizens, we need to tap into their interests. And I personally think this is the wrong approach by governments, because at the end of the day, one day we will have to get the legitimacy from citizens both for enlargement and for reform. There are countries like France which foresee referendums on enlargement. There are other countries like Denmark or Ireland which foresee referendums on reform. And we cannot get either enlargement or reform around the citizens. We need to engage them. And this is why I'm currently a little bit pessimistic about the way governments are handling these two issues because they are so afraid of discussing them before the elections that they completely put it on the back burner. And we know that in June, after the elections, they want to agree on a roadmap for reform, and maybe it will come back again. But if it comes back up again, it's a signal that they want to circumvent the discussions around the elections.
Or they are as diplomatic as Donald Tusk, saying that they have this pragmatic approach and we don't really know what it means. So my question would be now, do they don't want to talk about the EU reforms with citizens, or they don't know how to talk to them about the reforms? You know, we've done a simple exercise taking the proposal from the European Parliament and disseminating it to students for a few weeks so that they can look into these proposals and then comment on them. And basically, on this random sample of social science students, we have seen large support for majority of the proposals. So in other words, what are we afraid of? To go to people and talk. So with this, I will pass the question to Kalypso. Kalypso, what is your opinion as a scholar on democracy, on communication, on transnational understanding among the peoples of Europe? The leaders don't want to talk, or they don't know how to talk?
Wow, Carolina, so much has been brilliantly said in person. So it's always difficult to intervene in virtually here. But especially since I would like to address your paradox with body language, and the body language is that I think politicians understand very well that everything that Marek said, and all of you said, that Europe needs to take on more stuff, security, health, So competence is up, powers up, doing things at the European level. But on the other hand, democracy, control, down. So we need this kind of double movement, and that's what confuses people. And your example of vaccine was right spot on. Yeah, sure, we understand. We need to procure them together, do research together. But we need to understand at the national level, at the regional level, at the city level, in our neighborhood, and even in our family, we're in control. And that's this kind of double movement that European politicians, but everyone else needs to negotiate. And this leads me to, build on what Nicolai just said about the 2005 trauma, is that, yeah, politicians have this trauma to this day. I mean, which is a bit weird, almost 20 years later. But the story we need to tell is that to give power to the people, using big words, but I think they matter, does not require, pan-European referenda. There are democratic alternatives, proxies. And if we use them, we will take the wind out of the sails of the far right. So at the European level, we can have preferenda. This is a whole story that we've built over 15 years about preferenda, preferences, an agenda. Surveys, but on a kind of democratic scale. We have also, secondly, fascinating AI-enabled platforms that are not used. And the Commission is trying right now with the panels, but it's not happening. So we need a lot of young people to help us think about how Europe can make its entry into the world of platforms and democracy, like police and others. Thirdly, and connectedly, what I call the democratic panopticon. Putting everything on the web. This is the radicality of sunlight. Marek and Yarrow started off, as he is always very grounded, Yarrow, I know, and, resources. Cool, resources, but any resource, even if they're debts, like the Next Gen Fund, eventually come out of the taxpayers' money one way or another. Even if it's a corporate tax, it means they don't get the corporate tax in the national revenues. Well, if that's the case, then they need to know how that money is spent. You can't have debt in the name of European citizens if they don't. Now, I and many others have advocated for putting every spending of the 750 billion, well, it's less than that for reasons we know, but also of the regional fund and EU budget in general on the web. This is a very important point because, you know, in the south of Italy or the Greece or in any countries, because corruption and nepotism is everywhere and not just in the potential enlargement countries. Well, we need citizens to know how this money went in which pocket to buy, you know, solar panel for every municipality in that region. Why isn't that on the web? Now, the EP has adopted a recommendation that the 100 top would be on the web, but it's not known, it's not done. There is a lot of commission-led accountability. It's not at the micro level, it's not done. And not in the eyes of the citizens. So you spend money, you let them know. And fourthly, of course, my advocacy, my biggest advocacy, the EU does not need treaty reform to adopt a permanent citizen assembly, could be a youth assembly, could be a people's assembly that would sit permanently with a rotating membership. It would meet all around Europe and not in Brussels. So it wouldn't be one more institution up there. And it would connect with local democracy. So it would be a translocal thing. And I think, Caroline, this, you know, doing all of this democratic package is the pragmatic approach that your prime minister is advocating. So I agree with both Tu and Marek, because we need to deliver on democracy now. The problem with treaty change, it will, to get it up running, to hold it for 2 years, to go through ratification and all the rest of it, will not come into force probably more or less at the same time as enlargement if we're optimistic. So we don't have a choice. We do democracy now, and we work on a convention that itself needs to involve citizens and be very democratic. And you know, this will then prepare those two legs work with each other. Because, you know, let's say we adopt stuff on the rule of law, that you don't need unanimity to trigger Article 7, for instance. Well, this is where you need democratic respect, democratic trust. I think Jacques spoke about it too. I find it really hugely problematic that in these elections in Poland, you know, many citizens still believe that, well, it's a dictate from Brussels, you know, the rule of law. I mean, I'm sorry to advertise my own work, but I did write a book with Adis Merdzanovic called The Citizen's Guide to the Rule of Law, why we need to fight for the most precious human invention of all time. The rule of law issue is like oxygen. You know, we don't realize we need it until we don't have it. And citizens need to own this and internalize this. And this is a huge story for Poland, but not just for Poland, all around Europe, including my countries, France, Britain, and Greece. My God, we need the rule of law. So let's not finger point to Poland or even Hungary, where there's so much democracy at the lower level, right? So rule of law needs to be owned, budgets need to be owned. If we do all of this now, and if we advocate this in the European elections, it will make an eventual convention and treaty change much easier, because you will have the underlying democratic ethos that creates some sort of citizen ownership and trust in the kind of mutual pooling of sovereignty that will necessarily go on in this treaty reform. So that's my advocacy. If you have one word to remember, is walk with two legs, the democratic one and the institutional reform one.
Yes, and now back to Jarosław, as you said. Jarosław, you have this very institutional, Brussels-oriented perspective of an insider. And, you know, my question would be a repeated question. You followed EU leaders in many cadences and rotations, and don't they have the capacity to talk about the reforms and sell them to people, explain them to people the honest way? Or is it simply that they are fearing something?
It's quite complicated, I think. But let me start with answering your first paradox on public opinion and leaders. You know, it immediately came to my mind the words of our classic speaker, Lech Wałęsa, who said, "I am in favor and even against." you see, when you ask citizens whether they want Europe to be more effective, they would say yes. But when you ask Europe whether they would like to take back control, they will say yes. Because they want all good things at the same time. So depending what kind of question you put. And obviously, you know, this rhetoric of having more control or having, for example, if you say Europe should have much more consistent foreign policy. So you should ask citizens, do you want your Minister of Foreign Affairs to be closed and Marek to be unemployed? Because de facto, if you've got a strong common foreign policy, what for is an individual member state policy? So when you ask citizens whether they are ready to give up some competences to Brussels, the problem is, and here, for example, I have a bit of problem with the report of 12. The problem is that you are trying to take competences and transfer them to the European level, but you don't tell people that the competences, national competences, will be taken out. So you have to think about it, why people are not really happy with that. And then you propose a constitutional treaty, and are surprised that some people are saying no. And that is not only trauma that says, but the question how you explain this, that you are willing to make more Europe, better Europe, more efficient Europe, but then you do not explain that it is related to losing of. Once in Bruegel, the think tank in Brussels, there was Enrique Letta speaking on Europe. He was still prime minister at the time. And he said many things about Europe. He was saying frequently, he used so frequently, we need more Europe, that I was somehow touched and I asked him, but Mr. Prime Minister, you say we need less Italy. If you say that you want to have a more Europe. He didn't really answer this question, but the problem is that you do not explain at the same time that it means that you've got less of your national competences. And that it should be. I've got a bit more problem with the report of 12, if you allow me to say this.
Of course. And after that, we'll open the floor.
Yeah, okay. Because I have read it 20 or maybe more times, because it's excellent. The problem is that it's excellent on something. For example, Tu has explained to me sometimes that it doesn't relate to Euro. You didn't cover Euro. No. You see, there are problems which are important for Europe and they are not covered. The problem here is that it was requested by the ministers on specific issues. And I know this, it means here what is the problem is not what is in, but what is not.
Not there.
And therefore you propose various reforms on issues which might have a very little to do with problems that we face now. If you look at the Lisbon Treaty, after Lisbon Treaty, and our introductory speech, it was explained this poly-crisis, we had a financial crisis, we had a Greek problem, we had a migration, we have a Brexit, we have a COVID. Nothing what was really discussed in terms of Lisbon Treaty was not fully helpful to solve these issues. And all the preoccupations that were before were not covering this type of issues. Do we have a preoccupations which what might happen if dollar will collapse and euro suddenly will be under huge pressure? In this report, unfortunately, there is nothing. So that's a problem. That's a problem here. That it is being requested by two countries, and here I smell a bit kind of an intention to leave things as they were. To have these two countries, I am provoking you, I do it in purpose.
Effectively.
To keep control like it is. What is discrediting this reform for me is the fact that there is Weimar Triangle is not taken into account. There are two countries which says we want this to happen, and now please comment.
But you know,
whether-
Poland was then sitting in a corner, being very
Yes,
defensive. I don't think
yes,
it was a good
yes.
partner to
So
create
this
a
very
common
good report,
document.
I think, now should be somehow complemented
Yeah.
by totally new work, looking at issues that we have to solve, and then to see. I mean, all these issues may not require treaty reform. They might require treaty reform, but may not. For example, agriculture with Ukraine. And, you know, one of the reasons no one has really convinced me that if there is a prospect of Ukrainian accession, this requires treaty reform where you've got more powers to European Parliament, or you have to change name of a commission to executive body. There is no linkage here. So I think here we have to think again by looking what kind of problems Europe faces, what kind of issues require changes, where Europe should be reinforced, how member states should be improved. And then from that, we should look at what we could do. And then if Weimar Triangle is to be useful, and I wanted to compliment Marek for being very diplomatic. If Weimar Triangle is going to be useful, it has to do something that takes into account views of Poland, of Germany, and France. This might be much more powerful than having only two countries trying to push things forward.
I think we are on this track exactly now. There's a lot of going on.
Sorry.
30 seconds, and then I would like to offer the possibility to also our audience here to ask questions.
Yes, very briefly, I do have to respond. Of course, the report was asked for, mandated by the French and German ministers for Europe, but we work very independently, so we were never told what to write or what not to write. I think that is important to emphasize. Here, the mandate was, of course, also focused on institutional questions, and that simply has to do with the fact that Laurence Bourne at the time and Anna Löhmann are part of the General Affairs Council. So our mandate was sort of circumscribed by that, which is why we, in fact, do not deal with policy reforms. That is very true, and that is a criticism that is readily accepted, but also simply relates to the mandate that we were given. Now I forgot the second thing I wanted to say, actually.
Nobody is perfect and no document is perfect. I think you've done a fantastic job as a starting point for the discussion.
And yes, that was actually the second point. And of course, we saw our work as a starting point for the discussion. And we, of course, also in the beginning, we knew the criticism also that it was a Franco-German group or a group that was composed of French and German experts. So we made actually quite a lot of effort also to reach out to other member states, to other experts, to Polish officials as well, to candidate countries to also get in more European views and really have a pan-European approach to the questions and not a Franco-German one. So that only on the sort of more structural parts of the report.
Thank you very much. I have more questions on my paper here, but let me now open the floor and wholeheartedly encourage all the people, young people, students, academics, to pose questions to our guests. I know that Tu and Nicolai in 5 minutes will have to run. The other two participants will stay. So maybe if you want to prioritize, maybe have questions to our German friends, go ahead. And don't be shy. This is the time, please. Yes, could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, for sure. My name is Lena. I'm Bosnian and German, actually. And I do have a question for Ms. Nguyen, because she was talking about funding reforms, amongst others. And I was just wondering, if we talk about not funding further EU members that go against the original values they subscribe to, shouldn't we also go perhaps as far in the future as to impose sanctions on them, because we do have the possibility to do that? Do you think that's realistic?
To impose sanctions on member states that violate the rule of law? Yes, and I think that is already being done. So we already have this new conditionality mechanism where funds can be frozen if member states do not adhere to rule of law values anymore, and that has and if that has an impact on the budget. So the scope of it is circumscribed, but that possibility already exists, and it has been used against Hungary. Of course, we can talk about different kinds of conditionalities, as you say, and sort of, can we expand the scope? Can we use it differently? Can we maybe make rule of law a precondition before money is dispersed rather than freezing it afterwards? But I think those are very relevant questions, and that are also being discussed, I know, in Brussels.
Thank you. Any other questions at this point about everything that was said? Serdecznie Państwa zapraszam do zadawania pytań. Teraz jest ten czas, kiedy można się nie zgodzić. Bardzo proszę. Tam pan z tyłu.
Thank you. So I'm both from Lithuania and I'm Polish, and I was studying in the University of Wrocław. And we heard a few times, I think, from Minister Pravda about the smaller, less important countries that are imposing veto, or in general that they're like blocks of Weimar Triangle, or for example Poland, that are trying to make the Visegrad group. And I have a question basically to everyone of the experts. So do you feel that the future of the Europe is kind of consistent on those non-really institutional groups like Weimar Triangle, or do we have like the Europe of the equals?
Maybe Nicolai, and two few last words, and I know that in 3 minutes you'll have to get a taxi. So
yeah. So first, let us apologize for having to leave so soon. But there was only one direct train to Berlin, and the next one is 5 hours later, which speaks about maybe the lack of connections between European cities that are still deeply necessary. But to answer your questions, I think the EU will need to find a balance. I think on the one hand, it's all member states should have their right to voice and should be part of the negotiations, and there should be no precondition that smaller countries have a lesser say in the EU than others. And this is what we have in anonymity. And I think even if we talk about more qualified majority voting, it should be designed in a way that everybody comes together and tries to find a consensus. And we actually made a data study, and in almost all of the decisions, even where there is qualified majority voting, the EU still decides by consensus, because it strives for all member states to be able to accept their votes. And we have seen small countries playing a leadership role. For instance, Estonia plays a big role on trying to bring the EU debate forward on security, and they all bring something to the table. What I think is, what we should not look negatively of, is these groups of countries, so the Visegrad countries or the Baltic Three together with the Nordic countries. We have sometimes the Southern Seven or the Weimar Triangle, because if we think about an EU of 30, 35 countries, and imagine they all have to come together and have a decision together, I think it helps to find together an agreement if first smaller groups of countries come together. And I think this actually is a way maybe to balance a little bit Germany and France, because the difference is so high. I mean, Germany has around 18% of EU population, over 20% of GDP, and then you have a country like Lithuania, which is lower, I think lower than 1% of the EU's population. And to balance that, I think these groups of countries can actually help to balance off a little bit the dominance of Germany and France. And I think this is something that we should encourage rather than view critically.
anything to add?
No, I fully.
Just goodbye.
Yes, I fully agree with what Nicolai said, and I apologize that we have to rush off.
Of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I hope that everybody will forgive you for deserting the stage at the moment. Big bravo for both of you. And we will still stay here to address these questions.
All countries. It was more about those who are restricting themselves because they think there is only blockade as a way of being important, of playing a role in the European Union, and I think that in my country it's advisable to be a player, but it's not really about big and small countries. It's about how to be present in European discussion.
Thank you very much. Jarosław, would you like to add anything at the end?
Yes. On this question, I think Marek, as I understand what he is saying that small countries have got, even if they have ambitions to change things, they understand possibilities. It was said very clearly that the voting power of Germany is 18 times bigger than Lithuania. So it's a reality. But for smaller countries, for all smaller countries, it is very important to have a kind of a defensive instrument in case the national interest will be seriously affected. You could easily imagine that, for example, it would be quite easy for many European countries to decide something on Turkey, where Cyprus would think it affects very strongly its interest because of the division of Cyprus. So in this sense, Cyprus thinks that having a right to say no in a unanimity process, it's very important. I would rather be cautious in advocating hasty reforms. That we have one problem with one country blocking some foreign policy actions. Because if we concentrate on this issue, we change basic rules because of this one issue, and soon we've got other problems. There is always a question of that sort, that you should not change constitutions too frequently. If you do not change constitution too frequently, why you should change the treaty of the EU also frequently? If you have listened to Nicolai, he said about the voting potential of all countries that might be in the next enlargement. Ukraine, Moldova, and Balkan countries are more or less have a voting power because its voting is related to the population of UK that has left. And we've got a very good Lisbon Treaty, which has been changed, and which have changed. It was a period of very frequent changes of treaties. Treaty of Nice, there was a proposal of constitutional treaty, and Treaty of Lisbon. And thinking that you could change things so frequently and to add new elements because of the current situation is a wrong approach, I think. Therefore, I think we should, having the system which is already in place, we have to think how to better use it. And in order to think how to better use it, we have to think what kind of problems we need to solve. It's a question of, for example, views of the citizens that we have to better reflect. Kalypso has been saying about the question of resources and also decisions, who is taking decisions on the resources. There is a famous statement, saying, there is no taxation without representation. But I think we could make it opposite. There is no representation without taxation. If European Parliament is not putting up taxes on citizens, it means if not saying what should be done, what kind of burden should be imposed on citizens, how to fully represent these citizens. I mean, you have to think also in these terms as well. Therefore, what I like, for example, is that among those elements to engage European public and citizens, there are very few examples of proposals, and what is Kalypso suggesting is at least trying to address the issue, which is quite significant. Engagement of societies, of individuals, into the process, which starts from the engagement in domestic, very local policies, domestic policies and also European policies.
Dziękuję bardzo. I ja myślę, że właśnie tym ostatnim zdaniem moglibyśmy zakończyć dzisiejszą dyskusję. Ja właśnie widzę, że Kalypso podniosła jeszcze rączkę, natomiast chciałam powiedzieć, że zgodnie z wieloma raportami czy analizami być może to właśnie przekonanie obywateli do potrzeby reform jest najbardziej niedocenianym wyzwaniem Unii Europejskiej i nie właśnie odejście od jednomyślności czy stworzenie nowego funduszu finansowania wspólnej obrony, tylko to, aby wytłumaczyć to naszemu demosowi i po angielsku to take citizens on board. Kalypso, wiem, że chcesz jeszcze coś na koniec dodać. Mamy 5 minut po czasie, więc proszę Cię o krótki komentarz. Dziękuję.
Well, I can't resist because Yarrow spoke so rightly, but I want to back him and back all of those of us who say, you know, where do we spend our energies? Do we reinvent the wheel that was from the very beginning of the EU? How to deal with this problem of very small states, very big states? And our friend from Lithuania, I'm very glad that he asked the question because Lithuania has 3 statuses of problems of domination in the EU. The small states, but then we have like the Benelux country, they manage that, getting together. New states, that's the Visegrad story, and peripheral states, all those at the periphery of Europe, which I actually believe are the soul of Europe. And why these 3 matters, small, new, peripheral, is that you've got the big guys, the French and Germany, who, you know, well, we've just heard about the report that was ordered, by who? France and Germany. You know, I'm French and partly German, and I mean, I believe there is still to this day an issue. Poland is actually clever, you know, in creating the Weimar Republic. But how much does it balance the fact that, yes, we're talking about national interest. Yes, you're right, Yarrow. But we're talking about a very fundamental reality of what Europe should be, perhaps is, but should be at least, which is anti-hegemonic inside the continent. It was created not only because war, but why war? Because big states want to swallow small states for the last 500 years in Europe. That's the big hegemon. They're big elephants and they trample on small states. So Europe very, very, very rightly overrepresents small and medium-sized states. And that's not just a matter of interest. It's a matter of deep, deep principle, deep norms that are really in the DNA of the EU, but are forgotten again and again and again. So of course, here we're speaking from a big state. Poland, you know, so luckily, you know, enters this whole European story as a big state 20 years ago. But interestingly, it's also a new state, and it's also a semi-peripheral state managing the border. And so I think that's why I believe that Poland can be a passeur in this kind of intellectual ethos of bridging between the risk still of domination in Europe, at least intellectual domination or agenda-making domination, and the need to give a very prominent voice of those countries and their citizens that might feel that they're not quite part of this Brussels stories. So thank you, Poland, for playing that role, and all the friends in the room. And Caro, it's been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you very much to the participants, to the guests, to you, Kalypso. First of all, to Marek, Prawda, for being with us. I hope that you will pass the message to the Polish government. We have the role to play as an intellectual leader as well. Thank you very much, Jarosław. And thank you very much for your patience. We have overdone our time. Bardzo dziękuję. Mam nadzieję, że jesteśmy też nagrani, więc ci, którzy tu nie są, mogą to również obejrzeć, kiedy będą mieli czas. Dziękuję bardzo. Dziękuję bardzo.